Welcome to today's class on database basic. We'll focus our section or today's lecture on database construction and usage. As I said in the earlier lectures, where we spoke more about database design and how to create ER diagram, today we will see how to translate those ER diagrams and those ER models into an SQL statement. And for the part one of the SQL, we will focus on the construction and usage aspect. So, using the data definition language, the data definition language is basically a language that is used to create and modify objects in a database, such as views, schemas, and indexes. So, as I told you earlier in the previous lecture, we spoke about relations and relationship and how they are how different attributes, such as qualities of different tables, how they come together. So today, those relations rather will become tables, and the attributes becomes column. An example is to create a table name and list the table elements. So as we go further, you will see some of how this takes shape as we go further in today's lecture. So table declaration elements, whenever we are trying to create tables, so taking relations into table, there are certain elements that are needed, such as integer type, which are like numbers, floating numbers, also characters. You can also declare the number of characters when you're creating or specifying elements for a table. And there is a variable character where the variable size can also be declared. And there's also text where you have a string of unrestricted length. So these are the most popular SQL elements that you use during the course of this lecture and the exercise that will follow. An example is, let's say we want to create courses. We create a table courses, and we have one attribute here as code. It has a character size of 6, and also name as another column here as test. That is not null. Not null means that null value is not allowed by default, so it cannot be empty. That is what it means. So by doing this, you create a table courses, and it will have column code and name. So this is a typical example of translating relation to tables. So yeah, um, declaring keys. We spoke a lot about keys in the past. We spoke about how different keys are applicable in relation and how they impact relation. Uh, in today, like I told you in the other class, that we'll speak more on keys when we get to this lecture. So we already spoke about primary key, which you know is a unique identifier for a particular table. So each table needs a primary key. In any database design, you will have a primary key, which is basically a column of a table that uniquely identifies the role in that table. And we also have something known as unique keys. I know you might be wondering, okay, what is unique key, and then what is primary key? Well, unique key is also uh, a key constraint that identify an individual tuple in any relation or table. The difference between a unique key and a primary key is that a unique key can be null, but a primary key can never be null. So this is one of the difference. But both are also used basically to add certain constraint on tables. An example of creating a primary key is to create. Let's use the previous exercise where we created a table called courses. We had code with a character string of 6 and name, and the primary key is specified on the column code. So this shows how you create a primary key for any table, and as you've known, basically it enforces integrity constraint on a table. That's the essence of a primary key, to enforce an integrity constraint on each table. So that is what it does. And foreign key, we spoke also about foreign key in the previous exercise. As you know, foreign key is basically referencing a primary key in the order table, which is usually known as the parent key, and the foreign key is usually the child key. With an example, let's say we have an example here. Um, so with the example here, you can see that we have a table called given courses, and as you can see here, the primary key is course, and there's a foreign key here. So the foreign key is referencing the table courses, where the reference is on the course code. So here's an example. Now let's take something more practical. Let me show you an example using let's say a different table, something different also, so you can have much more understanding. So let's using the SQLite, let's create a table called suppliers. So, but before we create a table, let's say we have suppliers table where we have a list of suppliers, and we have the suppliers group where we can know, for example, if it's Apple supplier or Dell supplier. These are different PC brand or HP supplier. So let's take something like that where each of the suppliers can either belong to one or two group of suppliers. So let's take that example. So the first thing we will do is to create the supplier group. So let's do that. Okay. Now, just a minute. Okay, we are having some technical issue here. Let me exit and maybe. Yeah, I was having a little issue there before with the command prompt interface. So now let's see. So let's create first of all the supplier group. So we have so so you have the create table suppliers group. So we have the group ID as integer, which is the primary key, and the group name set as tests, not null. So if you click on enter, so you can use this command to check if the table is created. So that table is created. Now let's create a table name suppliers. So this is another example to also show you, at least to give you something different from using the course, and giving course at least to give you more elaborate explanation. So we have another table here named as suppliers, with supplier ID as the primary key, supplier name as set as test, the group ID integer. Now you can see that from this earlier table we created, you can see the group ID is the primary key, and over here that group ID is the foreign key, because we are referencing this group ID here where it is the primary key. So here is the child key and here is the parent key. So that is just an example to show you. Once that table is created, let's use the command tables to see. So those two tables are created, and now if we insert into the supplier groups, where in the subsequent lecture, as I go on the slide, I will also show you how to use the insert, but maybe I will skip that for now, and when we get there, maybe I will continue with that example. So let's just keep going with the course first. So the essence of doing the example is just to show you how to easily create a primary key and a foreign key. So just to show you from another example where you have the supplier groups and suppliers, so you can see how primary key and foreign key, how it works when you're using writing some SQL statements basically. And yeah, so I've explained about that. The the foreign key aspect, I've explained that already. So we go next to value constraint. So basically, you use the check constraint. It's basically an integrity constraint in SQL, which is used to specify a particular requirement. If you want certain requirements to be met, you use the check constraint. So this is one way of saying, okay, I want certain requirement in a column. So in this example we have here, so the requirement is set. So for the column period, so we've set the check constraint to set the period to be in this format. So that is just one of those ways to use the check constraint. And another way is, let's see an example of let's say you want to check. So here also you can use check in this format where you want the age to be either greater or equals 18. So this is another way of using a check constraint. These are all value constraints basically in SQL. So that is one way for you to understand how this work. Um, yeah. So this is another example of using the check constraint also. So basically these are for certain requirements in tables, so that way that requirement is met. And here, oh okay, I had the example here, I didn't know that anyway. So as you can see, this is another example of how to use the check constraint. This is also a value constraint in SQL. These are methods for you to set certain requirement in column, making sure that that requirement is met when you're trying to insert or update. As we go further in the slide, I'll also explain that to you. So the SQL data manipulation language. Well, sorry about that. You can see I'm having a problem pronouncing that, but so sorry for that anyway. The SQL data manipulation language is basically used for modifying SQL statement or tables and database where you want to modify, update certain tables or columns in the database. That's the next part we will talk about. So inserting data, how to insert data. An example is, for example, we want to insert into courses with the values given the course code and the course name. So this is one example of that. And also, if you're looking at the better way of doing, you remember we said earlier that we use the check constraint to specify a particular requirement. As you can see, this when you insert into given course, this way it goes through because that is the requirement we've set using the check constraint. But if you should insert with this other way, it goes against the check constraint we added to the table given course earlier in the earlier slide. You might get errors like this. So that is something you should take note of, and it's so important to show you this so you understand how this impacts your SQL statements when you're trying to modify table or insert data into table. So that is very important for you to note. So the deletion aspect also is the deletion is also another way for you to also manipulate data if you want to get rid of certain information or data from columns or rows in the database. You also have updates. So update the table, set certain attributes based on certain conditions. So this is also one other way of modifying or making changes to the tables in the database. And now we will talk about the queries. How do we query a database in SQL? So query is aspect is more about asking for certain information and defining certain conditions to get those information. We spoke about data definition language and data modification language, which are the secondary aspect actually of the structured query language known as SQL. The querying here we have algebra, relational algebra, where excuse me, Where operands are relations, basically variables representing relations, and we have operators that are commonly operations on relation, such as selecting rows, projecting columns, composing like joining relationship. So these are certain aspects of it. So we will show an example, but before I go on to that, I need to also make some clarification, so you don't get confused about what selection and projection means. So projection means choosing which column or expressions to return, while selection means how do you return certain rows. So returning what you specify what rows should be returned. So that is what selection means. While projection is about choosing the columns to return and the result. So that is the difference, and I need you to understand that before we go ahead. So selection basically is used in selecting, choosing what rows to show in a particular table, what result to show, what rows to appear in the results, as you can see from this example here. So we are selecting everything, like all column, all rows from the table called given courses, where the course is equals this. So the results, I guess, if I should ask you the results, I believe with all the explanation, you should also be all you should be able to answer that. So the result would be in this form where you have the whole rows where the course code is equals to this is presented in the result. We also have projections, which is basically you choose what columns to include in the results. An example of that is selecting the course, the teacher. So these are actually columns. So we are selecting the course, we are selecting the teacher from given course. This is the table name where the course is equals to this. So this basically selects the course and the teacher. So that is something you have to understand, the difference a little bit with projection and selection. With projection, we choose the columns. With selection, we select the rows. So that is something that is important for you to get. So this is the quiz for this week's part one of the SQL, where I want you to look at these two tables. Using this simple select statement, what will the output be? So you can return that via module, and later in the part two, by next week, we'll discuss more on certain other aspect, and give you more concrete examples and explanation as we go ahead in the course. Yeah, so thank you.